All right, folks, welcome back to Mike Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 29 today. We're going to be talking about Rudolf Steiner, early career and evolution, and we have special guest. He's a little bit of a Rudolf Steiner aficionado. We've got Andrew Tischler here with us today.
What's going on, everybody? Hello.
Yo, yo.
Hello. All right. So basically how we kind of got in contact is you had seen one of our videos on YouTube and reached out to me, and I thought your message was amazing. So much information in there that we didn't even cover. So I said, let's get you on here. So here you are. You were particularly, interested in talking about, you said you knew a lot about his early life and career and how that influenced his later work. What was the most important genesis of his early life, do you think?
Well, one of the most interesting things about reading his autobiography is he's saying quite early on that he's having spiritual experiences. So you're asking yourself, well, what does this mean, right? I've always been fascinated by the idea of having a spiritual experience and what that entails. And so a lot of this research is trying to figure out what does it mean. So you can read the autobiography. He doesn't say a lot about it. He doesn't describe it as much. It's just saying that it happens. I think that early experience, obviously, it created within him a need to explain it.
Sure.
So the early spiritual experiences and then the need for explanation. So something I find really, brilliant about Steiner is that the very first full book that he wrote was about epistemology. So if you ask the question, what's the most important philosophical question that humanity is facing? And I think this is a good little thing to just do a little. Why
don't you explain epistemology? Because there's a lot of people, I'm sure, that would be like, "What's that?"
Absolutely. That's a great idea. It's simply a theory of knowledge. So it's the question, what can thinking do for us? What's the extent of our knowledge? Can we know anything? And what does it mean to know something? So it's about thinking and about cognition and about the limits of knowledge. So the reason that's important, right, is that in order to do science or answer literally any question, you have to know what your thinking is capable of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, what are the boundaries of our, expanding mind, basically?
Right. And so, he talks a whole lot about Kant and this idea of the thing in itself, which is a philosophical term for the world outside of, the human being, the world before we see it and hear it and all that kind of stuff.
Is that K-A-N-T?
K-A-N-T, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I always question, can the human brain actually, actually understand God, or are we,
Exactly. So there's that, and that question was according to Steiner, and it was introduced before Kant, but Kant was one that really picked it up and actually wrote his whole book is called The Critique of Pure Reason, and so he's saying that he's critical of our reasoning abilities. Kant is. So Steiner, I think his issue was that he's having these experiences that other people aren't having. And then the philosophers that are eminent in his time, as in ours, are saying that, that they don't exist and that we can't know reality in these things. So his first book is about all of these problems, and it's fascinating how he tackles the whole thing.
Do you think, though, like, okay, so he was just saying we probably can't fathom God right now, but do you think, excuse me, do you think that it's more about being open to the idea as opposed to, because look, most mainstream scientists and that kind of stuff, they're gonna poo-poo. I mean, I'm on Reddit all the time, and I see people just, you're an idiot if you believe in God, or you're dumb if you.
Right.
That's a science religion. You're either
no, I know, but
it's that. If you're science, you're science.
Yeah, it's a religion of reality. We've talked about that before. They're literally basing everything on what we can see, even though our signal gets sent backwards and upside down into our brain from our visuals. So it's kind of an interesting.
So it's materialism, so
right?
That's really the dividing line that they have. So they're material monists. So they believe that the only thing in the universe is material things, particles, basically. And so Steiner actually has things to say about that in his early work, which I was super excited to discover, that he's talking about the philosophy of physics, and the philosophy of science as well as theories of knowledge and actual dry philosophy. He's got a lot to say about the material world as well. So it's a really important divide. But for Steiner, so this is my whole hang up, right? Is I've been reading Steiner for 6, 7, 8 years now. No one, it seems as if his career went unnoticed by academia. Not that it wasn't noticed, but they just didn't regard it, right? So at the age of, he was attempting to become an academic philosopher until about the age of 40 when he took this turn. So up until then, he had not mentioned anything about his spiritual experiences to almost anyone, and he wanted to establish himself in Germany as like the heir to Nietzsche. People were saying he was the eminent philosopher of Germany. He was writing these books. So he wanted to do that. What was my point? And
that his career was,
So just the question is, did he achieve it? How far did he, what did he achieve in his writings? And my hang up is that the philosophers seem to have not looked into it. And that's what I'd like to do, at least with my time here, is to look, how far did he go with his theory of knowledge? Did it make some kind of bridge that we have yet to make yet in philosophy? And this is actually exactly what he says. He's got one of his early books, he makes this quote about how, it's pretty miraculous. 300 years ago, we turned to religion to answer the questions about our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Within those last couple hundred years now, the scientific method and, the whole Enlightenment period has literally invaded our cultural way of being to the point that we now turn to science for those questions. Mm-hmm. So you and I and people that we consider reasonable, for the most part, if you get sick, you're going to not turn to the church, you're going to turn to science, right? So first, this is what Steiner mentions, is that the scientific method has gone so far into our culture, not just into our scientific work, but into our culture. But one particular branch of science has yet to make that, journey into our culture. And that branch is actually philosophy itself, not any of the natural sciences, but philosophy. So he says we never had a classical period in philosophy in the way that we needed to have, or perhaps that we could have or should have had. And that was what he tried to usher in. So his books are actually attempting to give us, he actually says, like, we have philosophers that are asking questions that no one is asking and providing answers that no one is looking for. And we have questions that everyone is asking that philosophers are not asking and not providing answers for.
Right.
So he tried to really humanize the philosophy side of it. Whereas Kant, he talks about, Kant encloses the human being within itself and it doesn't allow it to get into reality. So we can't know reality according to Kant. So for me, Steiner appears to have solved almost, so many of the philosophical issues in a more positive sense, rather than like a Wittgenstein or a Kant or these postmodernists that say we can't know anything. My supposition is that Steiner actually shows a theory of knowledge that's plausible. So the whole idea of being skeptical about reality actually goes right out the window with Steiner in his early works. The human being is meant to know reality.
Why do you think we've come to this realm? Like, if you look at, like, Plato, Socrates, even Aristotle, some of these people were speculating on crazy things that actually had bearing. It still has bearing in our modern world. What do you think? Why do you think we've strayed away from that? And it's almost become like, the reason why we're doing this podcast is I see society becoming kind of like, that movie Idiocracy with Luke Wilson. Right. It's just people are concerned with, how big Kim Kardashian's ass is at that day, or, the news, or Trump did this or whatever, as opposed to just living their micro life,
Well, I was going to add too, back in the day, science, religion, and art were all combined into one thing.
Music,
and now,
too,
and it's all been separated over the years.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. And Steiner actually stitches them back together. He even talks about the role of artists, and he talks about the humanities in his early works. So they all come together. Psychology falls right out of it. But so to answer Mike's question, Steiner has this theory of evolution, right? But it's about evolution of consciousness in the human being is a layer of that. And so there's this huge long arc to history according to Steiner. And it just so happens to be, so for him, Christ is the sort of crux of that. And I'm a born and bred atheist. I actually was not raised in any religion. I started my intellectual career, 16, 17, skepticism, right? Sure. So I'm a skeptical, atheistic kind of dude. I'm not a religious guy. But what I found in the last couple of years is that all of these mystics are Christians. And it was really like, baffling a bit. And then it's like, okay, well, you have to confront this. So Steiner is a very Christian person. And I actually, just to make a quick note about it, for Steiner, Christ is as much a philosophical fact. It's a piece of the philosophical puzzle and a piece of the natural world as it is a theological but anyway, but to get past that,
sure.
But historically, that's the crux. And so we are actually in the most so for him, the Greeks had a slightly different consciousness than we had. So they experienced the world in a slightly different way. And so then he actually goes back into other epochs and says that, for the Egyptians, the spiritual world was actually more prevalent, and the physical world was and it was more in the background. And whatever that exactly means, you could do a lot of talk about that, which is yet to be talked about by science and academia. But for us, the physical world is what's in the forefront. And for him, it's not a problem. In fact, it has to be that way, but there's going to be certain outcroppings. There's going to be, results of that being the case. And that's what we're seeing, is that it was necessary that we're in the lowest point. We've dipped so far into the physical reality and materialism that's all we can see. Yet there's, of course, still people out there that can see past it, people like Steiner. But I think that's just it's a symptom of where we are in the whole crux for Steiner. However, Christ being the crux means we've passed that center point and we're now going back up into the spiritual, right? So consciousness is gaining more knowledge of the spiritual. And that's for Steiner. His whole message was, now we're going to make this transition to reunite everything again.
Well, that's actually interesting you say that too, because there's some different documentaries. There's a Pyramid Code on Netflix and different things, but it talks about, like the golden age, like kind of what we were just talking about. And we go into these dark times, like the dark ages, where things aren't recorded, knowledge isn't retained. And now we're kind of we're supposed to be coming back out of that. So it's interesting you say that, because if you look at like the end of the Mayan calendar, it's an age of a new man. All these different, civilizations across time saying the same thing, that there's this procession, which is a full cosmic year, 25,900 years. And right now we're on the upswing of the next thing.
And so it's, this is his later work, and he's got, you wouldn't believe the mountain of material that Steiner left behind. I mean, it's unbelievable how many lectures he gave. A lecture every day of his life for about 40 years or 35 years.
Yeah, I listened to some of that stuff, man. You really got to pay attention or you're not going to follow it. At least I do. It's intense.
What's that, Steiner's lectures?
Yeah, the lectures.
It's unbelievable. You click on something and you think you're learning about one thing, and he's talking about something totally different. So that was my first couple years with Steiner, was just like impressed but totally lost, right?
Yeah.
So that's his later work, and I think it's important, like I've been saying, to talk about his early work. I know about some of his stuff, and your previous guest, Mr. Emerson or whatever, gave a, what's his name?
Rick Emerson. Yeah,
Rick Emerson. He knew a lot about it, and he did a really good characterization of it. I don't even know as much as I'm trying to work my way through it chronologically. So yeah.
Well, that's the main point, is you got to work at it. If you want to learn about this guy, you actually have to put the time in and work at it. And
I agree, and it for me it's more fun for me than watching like a movie, right? Like it's
absolutely,
because it's about humanity. There's still intrigue and all this stuff, but I make this distinction between consuming and creating. When you're reading a book, you have to create some understanding of it. When you're watching a movie, it's kind of all consumption. So yeah. Anyway.
I wanted to ask you about something. So I've listened to the Egyptian Mysteries lectures that are, I think you can find them on YouTube. But it talks about what you were just talking about, like the epochs and the changing of the time. And he goes through like the Egyptians and how their architecture was structured in such a certain way. And then you move on to the Greeks, who had it, they started to evolve and they opened up their pillars, and it was almost like reconnecting, to the spiritual realm, basically leaving that like overhead, like enough overhead. If you look at a lot of the Greek structures, that is kind of how they're built. There's a lot of overhead room or headspace, if you will. And then he goes on to the Romans, and basically that was the first time that we really started to kind of evolve into what we've become today. What do you think about all that? Do you think that that's, there's any validity to any of that, or?
That one, I've maybe listened to that one once, but I don't remember the points you're talking about. So I don't feel too comfortable saying much about it.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. But he even reminds me, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Marshall McLuhan.
No, never
No.
heard of him.
He's a guy Terence McKenna he gave a good lecture about. But McLuhan was a media savant in the 70s, which is a weird term, but he was an expert in how media affects humanity and culture. But it was something similar. He made, points about how when we invented language, we enclosed ideas, and that's when we first built enclosing structures. So like when language came about, so did building, and he makes this awesome relationship between that. So I don't have any problem with the strange way Steiner ties things together.
Sure.
But I'd have to look into that one. Yeah.
In terms of, so we're talking about all this. So like through your work though, you said you were an atheist. Has anything changed? I'm not saying that you for sure believe one way or the other now, but has it changed your outlook on the way that you look at that sort of, whether there's a God or an afterlife, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Again, I was absolutely staunch. I remember asking my father, I was probably 13 or 14, what happened? What do you think happens when you die? Not that I was looking at him as an authority, and he told me, I think we're dead in the ground, right? I don't think there's anything after it. So that's what
brutal.
Yeah, I kind of laughed about it. So I have to confess it, and it was not easy for me, but reading Steiner, I've been reading him for about 7-8 years. Within the last 2 or 3 years, it's kind of worked its way into me where I'm much more comfortable with ideas of afterlives and stuff like that. And the simple reason is that for him, he's a monist the way that scientists are monist. Scientists are material monists. For Steiner, it's about consciousness. And with consciousness, all things are possible, right? It's not the same thing as material. In fact, material itself is consciousness. So it's not just a sort of faith thing, but it makes perfect sense to me how, I could experience something else. And I probably see that the thing about it, right, is that he actually shows that the way that we construct our scientific theories about who we are not plausible. So the conclusions they come to are not plausible. And in fact, it's not just a faith thing. It's not even just philosophy, but scientifically, the idea of materialism is totally unfounded. The hard problem of consciousness. Have you heard of this?
No, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
So what does he believe that happened? What does he say happens when you die?
Well, for Steiner, so I have this thing. I think consciousness, right? This is a little definition I've come up with, is consciousness is a process in the universe that the universe itself employs when its already existing laws are no longer sufficient for it to proceed. So it's already developed a bunch of natural laws for how things like chemistry and crystals and even plants and animals, right? But then it hit it's on, it's the vanguard, the very edge of evolution. That's where we are. So we are we're carrying the work of the universe, right? We are the universe working. And so it gave us attributes to accomplish those goals. And the main attribute it gave us is consciousness. So consciousness is an incredibly important piece of the universe and its evolution. And so its job is, the universe wants to nurture that consciousness. We are doing something for the universe, so it takes care of us. So our consciousness is a quality that the universe wants to keep around and add to and let grow. So for Steiner, I think it follows that he believes in reincarnation and he believes in karma, which is simply the universe, allowing us to get better at what it needs us to do, right?
Right.
So for him, the idea of living a life and then it being erased is not only senseless and non-scientific, but it doesn't follow from his view of the universe. So for him, we are going to go on and we're going to have to keep going, right? Like, I think suicide is not a way out. It's just a furthering, you're going to have another experience on the other side of this.
Speaking of people,
I don't know, Anthony Bourdain.
R.I.P. People get help if you need it. And we've all been there,
I always want to put, and mental health is something that I don't have a grasp on, and it's incredibly difficult. And I don't know if he was suffering from some kind of mental health.
Yeah, I definitely have.
It's very hard to be critical about anyone that's suffering. Right. Suffering is actually probably the biggest mystery in the universe is suffering and how, but at the same time, it's just what if it doesn't end, right? What if you're not dead in the ground? What if you have to keep going? Like you have certain relationships in your life or certain things that you're trying to do. What if they don't? What if you have to solve them? And I think it's pretty fascinating. It's very so in that way, he actually really you know, for Steiner, humanity is the capstone and the center of the entire world structure. Humanity is everything for Steiner. We're not just an accident. We are, you know, the precipice of evolution. Now there's many hierarchies beyond us, but we're one of the leading edges. So for all of that, so he, you know, for him, it's a continuation. And it's going to be a lot like this. You know, we have this idea that our lives are petty and that our relationships they're not. I think, you know, that this stuff is the universe trying to become more complicated. And so,
right. Well, I don't want to correlate the two together, because I do think that one has more scientific merit than the other. But both Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner both talk about free will and how, with karma and the balance of the universe, and if you're looking at things scientifically, there is a balance or a duality kind of to everything. Then that would mean that if we didn't have free will, and like you were talking about Sam Harris saying that every action and everything is just pointless because it's just programmed into us through neurological memory and all that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to get at is, though both Steiner and Cayce talk about how God would be a bad God if that was the case, meaning that there would be no point to anything, and it's just the dumb universe theory, which everything's an accident and all that stuff,
right.
As opposed to creating free will. And you were talking about reincarnation. There's books on family karma and what happens in the next life that carry over and all that kind of stuff. I think that I believe in that kind of stuff to a certain extent. I don't know how much of a carryover it would be. You know, if you
absolutely right.
killed somebody by accident this life, are you going to have to pay in the next life? I don't know.
Right.
But
Sure.
We do have an effect on the universe. There is a ripple. There's a vibration that we create. And I was just curious what you think on that, like the whole free will aspect of it.
Well, so this reminds me of that first question: is what's the most important philosophical questions that are facing humanity? And so he actually starts. So again, the way I found Steiner was this book, The Philosophy of Freedom.
Okay.
That title, you know, grabbed my attention. I was reading Sam Harris. We don't have free will. So what you know, I was willing to read this book. It seemed interesting. The thing about it is, like you said, so if we're not free, not only are we in a dumb and blind universe, but we're literally just witnesses and it makes suffering just abhorrent and unbelievable. Like, you know, any pleasure you get, that's fine, but you have no control over it. You know what I mean? It's
right.
Yeah.
It's you know, this is the whole gripe about post-truth and postmodernism and this kind of stuff. You know, if you follow that philosophy, then the culture that you're going to get from that is just one, you know, they talk about, rightly so. I mean, it's really interesting, but they talk about the way that the legal system gets affected by that. You know, what do you do with, you know, and maybe it doesn't get affected too much. So there's a lot of debate in philosophy. But anyway, the idea of living without freedom should really scare people, and it pointed me in the direction of wanting to find out. I you know, it looks as if Steiner may have given a lot of insight into the problem of freedom, because it truly is a very, very difficult problem to find out how it is we could be free. And it's really important to look into all of that science and all the philosophy. They're not, you know, non-esoteric people are, you know, even Steiner points out, are doing unbelievable work, and their insights go really far. They just don't go all the way.
Right.
So I just think without freedom, there's really nothing to talk about. We would just be here looking. It seems it has to be there for any of this to make sense. So my thing is just that I just rather assume that it's there than assume that it's not there.
Mm-hmm. What do we have to lose, right? Like, what do you have to lose? You're either
exactly.
dead and it doesn't matter, or it matters. You know?
Absolutely. It's kind of like a, you know, conversion of that whole believe in God thing. But like I said, I would want to find out. And so that's why I think, you know, this book is so important. I don't know. Does that come close to the question you asked? I don't know.
No, that does a great job of it. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, do you know if he ever experimented with any sort of mind-altering substance or psychedelic? I know back then, obviously, there wasn't things like LSD and stuff like that, but mushrooms have been around forever. People have been eating them. You know, Freud used to do cocaine before it was popular. So.
Right. Well, so I have two conflicting currents that I think about. For as far as Steiner goes, I know for a fact that the only worldly thing that he seems to have taken part of is something called snuff.
It's like tobacco, like shooting tobacco up his nose.
You sniff it, yeah.
Was it sniffing or
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the lip thing. I don't know. I don't really know anything about it, but
Yeah.
18,
Kevin knows about the lip thing. We were on a camping trip when you were younger. This kid put one little chunk of a chew in his jaw. This kid instantly
turned
turned
green.
white, swallowed it by accident. This it was,
yeah.
yeah.
Never do it again. Good lesson.
What about the nose? What is it? I don't know what. I don't know what
Snuff is like a bullet, like, you know, people do cocaine or whatever. I guess back then those were actually used to shoot tobacco or weed or hash. I think people have done before too. So that's what I took away from it.
Let's reiterate: we're not talking snuff films here. We're talking
no. So something called snuff that Steiner would have done in his early part of his life. I don't know how long he did it for, but he didn't drink or smoke or
right. There's a lot of shamans that use that though too. If you look at a lot of these shows, like Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia and all that kind of stuff, they show the shamans doing that. What you're talking about.
But this gets back to what Rick Emerson was talking about, where and it kind of makes me want to bring up there's two people that I research heavily. It's Rudolf Steiner, and there's this guy that's alive today. His name's Tom Campbell.
Okay.
He's a retired physicist. He's an American. He's worked for NASA, and he's had contracts with all these government things and missile defense. But anyway, it actually gets into the history of psychic research in America, which is cool to touch on. But have you ever heard of someone like Robert Monroe? Probably not.
Well, I mean, we know about the remote view. I know about remote viewing. I know about like the Montauk experiments, all that kind of stuff.
So this guy's Joseph. Yeah, this is him. Joseph McMoneagle is pretty famous. There's a guy named Ingo Swann who was an artist. So then there's Dean Radin, not Dean Radin. He's okay, but so it's Russell Targ gave a really great TED talk that got taken down about psychic abilities.
I've seen that. I've watched all of the expel or whatever you want to call them. Taking TED talks.
Right. So Robert Monroe was one of the guys that was around during that research that the government funded. So it's a really funny story, right? So like I think it was in the 50s or I'm really bad with history, which is kind of I gotta brush up on that. But
can't be good at everything, right?
Welcome to my world, bro.
So the American government learned that the Russian government had been putting millions of dollars or whatever into psychic research and in attempts to militarize it. So it freaked the American government out, and they went to they found a couple people to go to and say, hey, the Russians are doing all this research. If they get ahead of us, it could put us in danger. So we want you to do the research, but what they really wanted was for them to say all of this doesn't work. You don't have anything to worry about. So they were looking for their scientists to do the research and say it doesn't work. Well, the scientists did the research and they all said that it worked. And so they'd send these military guys around and say, oh, you're lying, you're scamming us, you're taking the money because it can't work. So there must be another motivation. And so then they would have that military guy, they'd make him do the psychic experiment, and they turn him into a psychic. And there's a story that this guy tells about, he's sitting with his hands like this because this military guy just performs, so it's really, really funny stuff. So Robert Monroe was one of the guys that was sort of around that whole thing. So he's a guy that spontaneously started floating out of his body at about 55 years of age. So he thought he was dying or going crazy or had a brain aneurysm. So we had all this scientific or health, ran all these health tests.
What, he's like astrally projecting? Was it involuntary or voluntary?
By accident. So he would just float, he would buzz and he'd float out of his bed. And so he was trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And when none of his doctors or psychologists could tell him what was going on, he wanted to build a lab to study what was happening to him because he knew it was happening to him, but he couldn't explain it. And he was being called a quack, right? You can't talk about these things, but it's happening. So then he employs this guy, this graduate student, nobody at like 27, Tom Campbell, to build him a lab. And there's another guy that they work together. And so these two young guys and Rob Monroe build this lab to study consciousness. And they didn't, there was no exchange of money, but they just wanted, Tom wanted Robert to show him the technique. He wanted to also expand his consciousness. Tom Campbell had run into meditation. Anyway, so Tom Campbell learns to meditate, but not just that, it turns out that, through karma and reincarnation, he had some predisposition to these things, and he was actually incredibly, incredibly good at it. So Tom Campbell learned to travel into astral space, relearned to do it at about 30. He was doing it as a child, but had forgotten. And so then from like 85, when he was 30 years old, until now, he's been doing scientific experiments in the non-physical, which to me is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
he would do stuff like, you know, so there's the whole, you ever heard of the idea about, what's it called, the Akashic records?
I mean, I meditate, and I'm not going to say that I've for sure seen it, but I
Right.
feel like I've come close to. You have to be deep in it, though. I mean, I'm talking like an hour into meditation. It's not
Yeah,
something that happens right away.
absolutely. So Tom Campbell talks about achieving that point blank consciousness state where you've, so it's a whole thing. It's really interesting to unpack. And I use Tom Campbell to bounce off Steiner, and I bounce back between the two of them because they seem to be doing the same thing, but 100 years apart. Now, Tom Campbell doesn't have the philosophical background that Steiner has, but he's very experiential. Anyway, I forget where we're going, but so yeah.
No, you were just saying that, like, you know, because Steiner, like you were saying, I think this is where it was going, was that, you know, a lot of his work was overlooked, and now you have these modern day people. There's this modern day movement. I feel it. I watch all these YouTube videos, and I do research, and I'm reading all sorts of books, and I think that there's a ton of mysteries out there. You know, consciousness is like the final frontier, but there's all sorts of like little subsidiary things, especially with like psychedelics. The research that they're doing, MAPS is doing the research with MDMA, and you've got California, they're doing research with depression and dying cancer patients, and with giving them mushrooms and them having mystical experiences, giving them peace before they die. So, you know.
Right. Yeah. So do you mind if can I let me steer the conversation for just a moment? I want to
Absolutely do your thing.
So just talking about his early works, like I was saying, so the important philosophical questions humanity is facing, right? So freedom. So the first thing is you can't find out if you're free if your knowledge is inaccurate, right? So then you have to find out. He points out that you have to, in order to find out whether or not we're free, we have to discover what our knowledge is capable of. So then he turns to epistemology, which he actually wrote the book first. So he wrote this book about epistemology, and he does this really, really interesting stuff where, so one fact about epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, is that you can't start with any thoughts. You can't start with knowledge to affirm what knowledge is. So he kind of points out this conundrum, whereas like with another natural science, you have assumptions. You assume that space and time exists. You assume that, you assume certain things exist. But with epistemology, right, it's the only one where you can't assume anything to start. So
Gotcha.
he poses this interesting question that in order for it to be valid, it can't just be built out of knowledge, because that knowledge may be incorrect, right? You have to, so he asks, like, where is there a point, how do you find the point previous to knowledge? How, this is where epistemology has to start. So what would that be? And it reminded me of, like, let's say when you're born as a baby, right? What he's talking about is he actually describes, so what happens is, as consciousness, we are faced with what he calls the given, which is just a philosophical term for the universe, right?
Okay.
God or whatever. So it turns out the first thing that happens to us is we discover that we are a consciousness that's in relationship with this given. We exist. It's simply, we exist. So you can't deny we exist. So obviously, even the staunchest skeptic and stuff, Dan Dennett,
Descartes, basically,
exactly like Descartes. So you say exactly like that, the Cartesian method. So then Steiner points out that you're at this place where what basically the situation is, your consciousness and the whole world is at flux in front of you, but because you have no concepts to apply to the world, he calls it this. It's like a flat plane where nothing has any more significance than anything else. So it's filled with colors, it's filled with sounds and textures. Your senses are working, but your mind isn't, right? So it's the universe previous to any mind being added to it. It's a fascinating idea. So you're in this relationship. And so he talks about, if you create something, creating means dictating every piece of the process. But if you don't create something, then there's a demand to explain it. There's a demand for knowledge. If you create something, there's no demand for knowledge, because you're the one that created it, right? So you know it. But if you didn't create it, then the knowledge is the first thing that needs to happen, right? It's just he calls it a desire for knowledge, in the same way we desire food or water. Humanity has a desire for knowledge. Each individual does. Can
I ask you a question actually about that? Because I'm actually kind of going through that right now. I play music. I was in a jam band. I've decided to take a little bit of a break, just kind of worn out from, all the aspects of it, recording and practicing all the time and stuff. And since, well, okay, I guess this was happening before, but I've been on this quest for knowledge, thirst for knowledge within the last 3 years. I've read more books than I probably have my entire life.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say it was an absence of the music, but they kind of started to evolve within that. So I wanted my interest lied more now with truth and knowledge and doing kind of what you're doing with, Rudolf Steiner, but kind of piecing together my theory of everything, if you will. What do you think? Do you think that's kind of along the lines of what you're talking about within the absence of one thing? Like, I'm not creating any of this knowledge, so therefore I thirst for it because I'm not actually doing it.
Well, exactly. Yeah. My view is that, imagine trying to survive in this culture, but had never been taught simple mathematics when you're in first grade, right? So you're a person that's missing this whole swath of knowledge that would be essential for you to survive, right? Or say you never got taught some very important thing. Well, that's the thing that Steiner is saying happened. No human being is being taught the most important aspect of what needs to be in their minds in order to be a fully functioning human being. We don't have a firm philosophical foundation for our culture. And so the more, the more you pay attention, the more sensitive you are, you start to realize that, like, it's a lack of mentorship, right? There's no strong mentor. Like, I have no strong mentor in my life because I have my father, but then I'd ask the questions like, well, why are we here? And he would blatantly say, well, I don't know. No one really knows why we're here, right? And so I was always fascinated by the idea that there's certain questions that are essential that we don't have the answer to. And that's what science is, right? But so, I think what you're saying is you feel like this, that's what I feel, is I feel like there's something that with it, I could go on and be creative and be successful in a very simple way, be the person I want to be, not a great philosopher. It's like we all have the burden of discovering truth because it hasn't been done yet.
Right.
That's a huge burden. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I'm not some physicist. I don't have
a good start, man. I'm not going to lie. You got some fascinating points that you're bringing up. So
yeah, I decided when I was 15, my dad would tell me, go to college so you can struggle and get a job. You're not going to enjoy it. You just got to prove you can do work, and then you're going to get money. And he just painted life as this whole struggle against existence. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not game for that.
I think most parents are like that. I know my dad. I love my dad, but he's all about he loves the work, So.
Right. So, but I just, I have one life, and I'd like to enjoy it. And I'd also like to know what it means. What's it about? So I just resigned to the fact that before I pursue any career or like any role in life at all, I'd like to know what it is how am I here? Like, my whole thing was I just got stuck on like all of the existential problems of what it means to be human. I couldn't, I wanted to play basketball. Well, how am I, it's just like, how do you define yourself as any of these things if everything is just at the bottom is just complete mystery.
Right.
That feeling really, that's what I stuck with. I'm not like gifted in any academic sense, but I stuck with that feeling of this doesn't make sense to me on an intuitive level, but I wanted it to make sense. So that's what I've been doing. But what I found is that, I don't have to lay it out. Steiner's already done that. Thank gosh, humanity has those figures, right? But we're ignoring it. So with Steiner's works, although they're philosophy and they are arduous to get through, they're still very, very simple. It's not like these other philosophers. Like, you tried to read philosophy today and you have to get a degree in it because that's not the way Steiner is. Although they're difficult, the books are all less than an inch thick. The Philosophy of Freedom is less than an inch thick. He's got a book called Truth and Knowledge. It's a pamphlet, and he attempts to lay a foundation of knowledge. It's unbelievable. And so I just need the philosophers of the time to read this guy, and I just want them to I want him to prove me wrong. Like, I'm still open to Steiner being wrong about everything, but it's just hard to fathom how he could be almost at this point. The more you turn over rocks, the more proof you find. So, right.
What do you think about the Waldorf schools?
Well, so the Waldorf schools, as with the Anthroposophical Society, which is the society that he founded, it's with any company. The further you get from that original stimulus, the further it seems to travel from that stimulus. So the Waldorf schools should be looked at as completely independent of Steiner's philosophy, and they're an enterprise that are built on his philosophy. They draw from its philosophy, but they aren't it. They're not synonymous. They're pretty great. I mean, I think being that they're based on his philosophies about how to educate children, and he has there's really great reasons as to why he should be an authority on that. He basically tutored his entire life. So there's some really great stories about his interaction with people at all. He's been an educator his entire life, so he had a lot to say about education. But it's up to them to employ those things. And if you have someone greedy, or I'm sure that I think that most of them are probably really great.
Yeah, I know a couple people that went there, and one of our friends has his daughter going there. So
the only thing is that they're trying to give these children a certain worldview, but the culture that they're embedded in is not that worldview. And right. So it's almost an impossible task for these children. And the thing is, they're also not, the emphasis isn't on Steiner or even his philosophy. It's just on his ideas of education, how to educate children. But so they don't actually learn his philosophy. It's not about learning about Steiner. It's just about how he taught people. So it's a great school, but it's not going to get them all the way. Everyone has to read his early work, I think, to get a grip on it. And maybe not, but
Well, I think it's better than going to school and learning that Egypt was 2,500 years old and shit.
Absolutely. Well, the thing about public education in this country is that it literally is indoctrination. It's nationalistic indoctrination, and it has the task of picking out leaders that won't question authority and suppressing anyone that is a little bit too unhinged, and then finding the whole working class. It's got a couple tasks, but none of them are education. So the public education in our country is not an education. It's a nationalistic and economic structure. It has
brainwashing, really.
It's just an agenda.
It is. It truly is. It's very sad. And so, like, I had a horrible experience in high school in public education. It was just because I was treated like varmint. I wasn't treated like a human.
I was actually going to ask you, where are you from?
I grew up outside of Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
Like Westchester, about an hour outside of Philadelphia.
Yeah, nice. I've been there. I got family from Philadelphia area.
Yep. But yeah, so it's just but back to your point, you're trying to be a musician, but you have this internal strife about life, which shouldn't be there, because we should embrace this holistic view of humanity in the world.
I've used it for inspiration in the past. Like that part of me was always like the fire that would always produce new riffs, new jams, new lyrics. But now I'm starting to realize I have this thirst, and it's like a vampire that can't get enough fucking blood, and I just can't get enough knowledge. Everything I read,
right.
I just can't get enough, and I get like so excited, and it's like literally I'm doing this till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, again, the universe, it's not that, we're not a tool that's created by the universe with a specific task in mind. We're not a tool. We have an opportunity, right? Because we're free. So each of us, we are given an opportunity, and we can say, I want to take the universe in this other direction, or, you can go with it. You can do whatever you want with it. But I just think that once you get, so once you establish, I think that's the drive, is you're trying to, you're trying to establish yourself as a useful part of the universe. And that's what's so exciting about it. And the more you connect yourself, the more you open up, the more pieces are dependent on you and you're dependent on them. I think it's very exciting. Like I said, I'd rather read in the right mindset. I love reading this stuff rather than seeing like a movie. When I want to sort of feel like I'm growing, I will read for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. What do you think? I was going to ask you about this. Two-part question here.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of biocentrism, which is this guy's book, Dr. Robert Lanza? He's a scientist, and he incorporates ideas like quantum entanglement, superposition, along with the fact that the base of the thing is that we're creating consciousness, meaning that what we see and whatever we're creating with, basically within, as opposed for it to being material and everything set already and us just being the observer. We're the observer that's creating this world that we're living in. Basically, it's kind of an interesting book. I've run it by some scientists on Reddit. They said half of it's bullshit, half of it's got some merit, so but like I don't know what to believe,
man. There's always
I don't know what to believe. Like, we did an episode on it. I recommend people listen to that because it is a fascinating book. It is worth a read. It kind of goes along with some of the points that we've been talking about with Steiner. but it actually incorporates a lot of like quantum theory and all that kind of stuff.
Well,
too.
so that's why I brought up Tom Campbell. Is he's a physicist, and he actually talks a whole ton about the double slit experiment and the nature of quantum mechanics. And so his book is actually called My Big Toe.
Yeah, that's popped up right when I pulled up his
so you said it earlier. Actually, you said you were trying to write for yourself a theory of everything. That's what toe is. It's a theory of everything. So so he calls it my big toe because he actually talks about this exact idea. It's his big toe, so that's his big toe. But he needs all of us. We all need to also have a big toe. So a theory of everything. So he wrote his big toe. We need to write our big toe, which is just our lives.
Right.
But so he is like I said, he's got insights into quantum mechanics, and so he calls himself a virtual reality theorist. He associates with virtual reality. And so just to get, I really like
we're in a simulation, or you just
simulation theory. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really fun picture to paint. So if you don't mind, I would do that. It sounds like it's very comparable to what the was it? Yeah. So
biocentrism.
Right. So Tom Campbell does these cool mind experiments, right? So say you are, think about an avatar in one of these games. Like he always talks about World of Warcraft. Now he's a 6-year-old guy. It's really fun to hear him talk about it. But so you're an avatar in World of Warcraft, right? You're an elf is what he talks about. So say you're a scientist. Say you have the mind of a scientist. You would like to do science, but you're an avatar in a simulation. So you could do physics in your simulation. You could find out how long it takes a rock to fall to the earth, and you could time it out, and you could learn that it's consistent, and you could find a formula as an avatar in a simulation. You could do these things. Depending on how good the simulation is, you could do a lot of physics. You could do chemistry if it was programmed into it, right? Now ask yourself the question, I'm this avatar, but let's just also add the human being. The human being is playing the avatar or whatever, but where is that avatar attached according to that avatar's reality? In the three-dimensional reality that avatar is in, where is it attached to the player?
It's not.
It's not, right? There's nothing in its reality that connects it to any part of our reality, right? Because that game doesn't include, it couldn't include like a connection from the virtual reality to our reality, right? So that virtual reality is kind of like floating in like a non-space in a certain sense. Yeah. Now, where it actually is floating is in our minds, right? We experience that reality. We see it on the screen and stuff like that. So, in fact, the virtual reality in the computer is really located in our minds, but so is everything else in that sense. But he just points out that avatar doesn't need to be connected to the whole structure that's supporting it. So what you have here is a metaphor for our reality. So he says the idea, so basically every time you hear virtual reality or simulation theory, what you're hearing is the person trying to express that they believe that consciousness is the monistic thing in the universe and not material.
Gotcha.
So, for Campbell, our reality is a virtual reality, which means that there is a supporting structure that isn't of this physical, right? He talks about we're in PMR. He calls it physical matter reality. Now we're a subset, and the set that's supporting us, he calls NPMR, non-physical matter reality.
Gotcha.
He keeps the matter reality part, but he calls it non-physical. And what he says is that depending on where your consciousness is, certain realities are going to seem physical and then non-physical. So if you're in this reality, the spiritual world has to feel non-physical in the same sense that if you're in the avatar's reality, the actual computer is not physical in that reality, right?
Right.
If you're the avatar in the simulation, that's the world. And you could never find the computer, the hard drive. But of course, it has to be there.
Right.
And for him, that's about how we are. So what we are is we're an avatar. We are a people. We're a consciousness. We are, somehow the universe gave us the attribute of being able to have consciousness. We have this stage of consciousness. We also have an I. We have the power to think. So these are all the different bodies that Steiner talks about. So for Campbell and for these virtual reality theorists, consciousness is being fed a data stream. There's a universal data stream. So for Campbell, we are all in a simulation, but it's a shared simulation. Like Grand Theft Auto.
That's what the Akashic record is that you're tapping into, is this plane that everything does exist, and if you can pick out pieces of it, cool.
Well, exactly. So, the Akashic record. So there's the physical matter reality stream that we're all typically in. That's the data that we receive when we're awake, right?
Right.
But when you go to sleep, what your mind is doing is not your mind, but your consciousness is neglecting that part of the data stream and asking for another data stream. So like if you're sleeping, that's a whole nother reality for Campbell. You actually go to, and again, you start to get a better, I really like the virtual reality picture because you can think of like files in a hard drive or something. So like the hard drive is the spiritual world, right? Now that's the hard drive, not the soft drive. That shit, that's what's real. Our reality is like a file in the hard drive. It's that our reality is much more non-physical. It's much more derivative in that sense, instead of being fundamental. And then, so the Akashic Records is like another part of God or the universe or that spiritual world that stores all of the data from. It's the past record. So if you think of a computer, it's just, it has every slice of the simulation saved. That's all. It's a memory bank. So, the universe created memory forever ago, and it has unlimited storage data, and it's been using it to its advantage whenever it needs it. So the Akashic Records is there because the universe saves everything. And so what you can do with your consciousness, you can sit there in physical reality, meditate, close down that data stream, and simply query the universe for anything else. And this is actually how Tom Campbell describes astral projection. Your consciousness, and you can query the universe for anything you want. Now, your culture has trained you to only query about this reality. And our crux in the historical epoch, as Steiner points it out, orients us to ask for certain things at certain times. But we're consciousness, so we have every possibility open to us, and we can ask for the universe. As long as the information exists, we can ask for it. So, Robert Monroe, Tom Campbell's teacher, literally talks about going to other realities, going to other planets, and talking to communities on those planets like a fucking Star Wars thing, right?
Yeah.
So you can read that. Tom Campbell doesn't give you the details, but he says, there's another guy, Emanuel Swedenborg, who was alive before Steiner. He's got volumes of his description. He talks to people on Mars, talks to people on Venus, talks to people, and like angels and spirits. So these people there's all of a sudden just bursts open at the seams, all this like seemingly fantastical stuff about communicating. But I'm saying the universe is vast, and it's not the physical universe, but the spiritual world is unbelievably big, and we're so that's kind of the picture.
Do you think the spiritual realm is a different dimension or something within us that's like a chemical thing, or what do you think it is?
Well, so going back to the virtual reality, I really, really appreciate it. It gives me the insight that sort of settles my mind when I ask that question. So dimensions is just an idea, I kind of don't get super on board with saying it's another dimension, because there's, dimensions is like 1, 2, 3 dimensions of space.
Yeah, I just mean like in simple terms, like something that we can't fathom or reach based on our.
So that's Tom Campbell's metaphor. Is everything is data, right? So this is the thing: is instead of matter or even consciousness, in fact, the universe is made of data. It's all information, bits. And so consciousness is a certain pattern of information. And we are embedded in another pattern of information, which is a universe, right? And that universe is embedded in another pattern, which is the super universe. And that's embedded in another pattern, which is the super universe. And eventually you find the Godhead. So there's a very systematic unflowing of all these information patterns. So as far as, what you're just asking, which pattern am I looking at? It doesn't make much sense to say which universe am I in, because it's all information. You're actually just asking about different sets of the information within God. So confusing yourself about which reality you're in, maybe that's not the clearest terms to speak about. It's not scientific to say that I'm in this reality or that reality. You see what I'm saying? Like, of course, it's a distinction, but it's not a fundamental distinction. And that's what you're getting hung up. Where is it? Well, where are you? We're all in God. That's the only place there is, right? We're all in consciousness. So he says, Tom Campbell even says, it's not about getting out of the universe or out of your body. It's not about getting out of your body. It's getting into your mind. And when you get into your mind, because your consciousness, you're just a set of information. You're a pattern you're just a pattern on the pattern of the universe. So there's certain people call themselves patternists. Their philosophy is a philosophy of patterns, and that's the constituent of the universe. Instead of something like matter, it's information.
Well, I'm confused. I'm just joking. I
think it made a lot of sense. I mean,
cool.
I've definitely, looked into all those theories too, and I think there's some merit to it. So I don't know. Again, I think that there's so many different avenues surrounding the same subject that you just kind of have to do your best. But what you're saying makes a lot of sense in terms of from looking at it from almost like out of the picture within, which I think a lot of people look, you know, what's in front of their face to without.
Yep.
Couple things I want to talk about.
Mhm.
I think Steiner's whole ego being the highest form of self thing kind of clashes with Eastern philosophy, which is that we want to dissolve our ego so that we can become one with whatever we truly are, which is part of this pure consciousness universe.
So you have to be careful. I'm not an expert in this, but I have a hunch, right? Like this, I'm going to steal this. I'm going to piggyback off this idea about chakras.
Okay.
So if you do the research, it turns out that our conception of chakras is only about 30 years old, yet we displace it onto history. And we think that that's exactly how they thought about it, right?
Okay.
But if you do the research, it turns out that it's really been developed in the last about 30 years. Since like the 60s, chakras have been, and so the idea of where they are and how many they have and what they do and stuff, you know, how many people are actually reading exactly what the Vedas wrote in Hindu and getting the right translation, right? So you have to be careful that you're not pasting a modern conception onto the past. So I don't know exactly how the ancient Eastern religions thought about what they were doing. But Steiner talks a lot about it. So my whole problem with the idea of dissolving into nothing is, for Steiner, you know, it's important to accomplish what you're doing in your life. What you're doing in your life has the utmost, you know, effect on the universe. So I think it's important to build. Like, I almost imagine we have to build a society that works, not dissolve into God. Right now, that may have been the goal at another epoch, but in our epoch, it's important.
I don't mean dissolve to. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think there's this.
So the ego thing.
Well, yeah. Okay. So like your ego can be a very actually bad thing. I mean, most people that I would see in public that are acting a certain way, they're egotistical. They're not even thinking about anybody but themselves. And I think that there's a lack of scope in that thinking, that you know, you've got this little angel and little devil. And I look at the ego kind of sometimes as like the little devil, because it's always pushing me in a direction that I know is wrong or I feel is wrong, but yet it's there and you want to satiate it or feed it, you know?
So there's a distinction of terms that you have to make. So going back to the whole thing about the relationship that you are in with the universe when you're born. So the universe is just this mass of undifferentiated sensorium, right? Well, the first thing that you discover about that is that there's one thing that's consistent amidst all the chaos, and that is the self. So the little baby is in a world of chaos, but there's one thing that's still, and so it takes refuge in that stillness, and it's always there, and that's the self. So the self is what's there, staying put while everything else moves. So then once you have the refuge in the self, you begin to build knowledge. So like, you know, physical scientists want to talk about how the brain develops, but what they really are asking is, how does the mind develop? So the mind develops along the path that Steiner describes in his first book. And so once that happens, you can work from that place. So your I, you need to be able to say I exist in order to do anything at all. So the ego is just the sense that I can say I exist and I can accomplish something. It's freedom. So consciousness, freedom, and the ability to love, which I'll get into, are all tied together. So for Steiner, when he says the ego is the highest member of the human being, it just means, like, literally, the Greek didn't say I exist in the way that we say I exist. Once that's the thing, is for Steiner, like, the Greeks and the Egyptians had a really radically different orientation of the universe than we did. They accomplished living in ways that are different. They didn't have, you know, like, the Greeks are responsible for reason developing. So it's not that they didn't have reason, but they didn't turn to reason in the same way we do.
They just used different building blocks to get where they were going.
Right. Different. Yeah, exactly. So I would love to experience the world as a Greek or an Egyptian for just an hour, because it was very, very different than the way we experience it. And when we would have a problem, we would employ different methods of solving that problem and all sorts of stuff. So that's what Steiner talks about as the ego. It's simply the ability to say I to myself. If you can't say I to yourself, you can't love someone else. You can't.
Right.
So that's what the ego is. Now, everything you're describing, Steiner agrees with. You don't, you know, love is about making space within your ego for someone else, right? Within your I for someone else. Now, the ego doesn't want to do that. So I always turn to Tom Campbell with this. He says the opposite of love is fear, not hate. So fear builds.
I agree with that, actually.
Yeah, so it's
I
kind
think
of
hate is more of like an error to me when I think about it. It's just an
yeah.
error in thinking.
Well, and hate is derived from fear because you fear this person. You wouldn't need to hate them if you didn't fear them. So it turns out that underneath of hate is this fear of the thing. So that's a big pull that we're trying to get away from fear. So your ego is what's afraid. So actually Tom Campbell describes the ego you're talking about as intelligence in service of fear.
Gotcha.
Your intellect in service of your fears. So your ego is literally made out of your fears, and that does not need to be there because you don't need to fear anything because consciousness is all that exists and love is the essence of the universe. So what you fear is the thing the universe wants you to get over. That's your karma. It's not there for no reason, and it's not there because you're weak or scared or because you had trauma or something like that. That's exactly where you need to be, but you need to come to the conclusion that you can overcome it. And if you can overcome it, you can overcome everything, right? Like you can love the world and the world can be better. So that ego is bad, but the ego in Steiner's philosophy is just that I that needs to be there in order for you to be free. That's your spirit.
Actually, I've had an epiphany where, so I was having a psychedelic experience and I was thinking, about my fiance and stuff. And I was just thinking, oh man, I love her so much. I think I had this epiphany to love somebody unconditionally, whether it's a brother, sister, fiance, husband, wife, child, whatever, is to love God, because you truly are loving somebody as if you were being loved unconditionally as the creator that you've been created by.
Well, not to diminish that in any way, but imagine somehow achieving that for every person. I don't even know what that would mean, but I think
that's crazy. That's a love field that's beyond.
That's like Jesus Christ type shit.
That's the love of God, is to love everything that exists, despite. But you're enacting that version of love for the single person is the most important step that can be taken, right?
Right.
And the more you add to that, and I don't know, I have no idea, but perhaps that's the way we look at enlightenment, is loving everyone or something like that. In the way that you're loving your fiance, which is unbelievable, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That's congrats. Yeah.
Well, thanks. One more thing.
A little jealous. That's great.
Look out.
Hey, look, I think everybody, if you open your heart and you're in the right place at the right time, I think it'll find you. You just got to be perceptive to it,
And again, it's a worldview. If you believe that the world is dumb and blind and that you're an accident, cosmic accident, well, it's a lot harder to work.
What you're saying about the building block. Look, when I started with my fiance, it didn't start this way. It progressed into this thing that, of course, we had an attraction or a mutual thing, and it just kind of grew and grew and grew and grew to this point, like you're talking about. Like, let's say you're building the pyramid at the base, it doesn't seem like much, but when you start getting towards the top, it really starts to make sense. One thing I want to ask you, though, to change, to pivot on that is, you talk about and I haven't learned about a lot of this aspect of Rudolph's work, but then there's the Christ figure, but then you have the two beings that oppose them, and they're not necessarily devils, but they're just in opposition.
Well, yeah, it's really cool. So for him, Lucifer, they're not devils. Lucifer is, I'm not great at this, but I can just give you a rough estimate.
Yeah, no, that's, I figured you'd know more than I would, and more than just reading it on Wikipedia. So
he talks about, so Christ represents this love that we're talking about, which is for him a balance point. But in order to achieve balance, there has to be two poles that you're balancing. So those two poles are Lucifer and Ahriman. Names are silly, but whatever. So it's important to understand the concepts behind what he's talking about. So Lucifer he calls the light bearer. It's the thing that he talks about it as having a really inspiring effect on an individual. It inspires them, it entices them, it intoxicates them, it tests them and gives them trials, and it says, oh my gosh, I want to go do this, I want to try this. It's this really knowledge-bearing, light-bringing force. But so that's what Lucifer does. He's responsible for enticing us. And then Ahriman is this other force, which he does look at as a little bit darker. It's a little bit the lower side of the pole. Ahriman, I really don't know too much about it, but he just kind of makes you lazy and sort of maybe skeptical. And
in Eastern philosophy, they talk the Ahrimanic presence is something that kind of what you're talking about, misleads you, brings you down a dark path.
It's basically. Right.
I don't know if you got that from that, but it's.
Well, I guess a good way to think of it, yeah. Like so the whole thing, you exist. If you believe that God exists and you move towards God, you're basically moving towards embracing the universe. But if you don't believe in God, or you don't feel like embracing the universe, you go into a place, you delve deeper and deeper into yourself. You dig a giant ditch hole into yourself, and that's where you act from. And so Ahriman is that I want to act for myself, from myself, because of myself. And Lucifer is, I'm, ecstatic, like the characterization of like people in the 60s on acid, just loony, crazy, ecstatic.
Right.
Those are two poles, but you have to balance them, right? And so for Christ is the balance. Now you need both of them to inspire you to those things. Because if you're up in the cloud, heaven's going crazy, you need to know that you exist. You have to have that self. So the Ahrimanic force will bring you back down. And then if you go too far, the Luciferic force will bring you back. But the whole thing is that Christ represents this. He struck the balance perfectly. And so those are those two elements. Like, again, the self needs to be there. You need to have the self. So that Ahrimanic element needs to be there, but so does knowledge, of the rest of the world. So yeah, that's the idea. So they're helpful, but precarious.
No, I mean, it makes sense. I always tell people that are, having a tough time or whatever. I mean, you can't know, without darkness, you can't see the light, basically. Like, you need that duality or that balance so that you can appreciate what's good or what's right,
Right. We need the two poles so that you can find the balance.
Right.
Yep. And so for Christ is simply the balance. And so that's what when I say Steiner is a Christian, it sets alarm bells off in my head, and it probably should for people in this culture. But what I'm trying to say is that that's a fact. That's a philosophical fact of the universe for Steiner, and it's not some hokum religious thing. It's the name that he's giving for the ideal balance between the two poles of the universe, right? That's the Christ. So I hate talking about the Christ. It's just Christianity has been such a negative force, and many people
I've been getting into Gnosticism. I find that an intriguing concept too, that the God that created us is not the true God, but a God that created us in error, from out of ignorance, basically. And like we like to speculate and throw around theories.
That's
I mean,
fantastic.
I don't know, have you ever read, I don't necessarily go by it as like a Bible or anything. I thought it was an intriguing read. Have you ever heard of the Urantia Papers?
I'd like to look into it. I'm definitely intrigued. Yeah,
definitely. It talks about Christ as a spirit that comes down, and the difference between Urantia.
They share a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's different. It's more about not aliens. Like, they don't talk about aliens, but just that there's this whole, like what you were saying about that Tom Campbell guy. There's a whole community of angels and networks and structures within the universe that we just can't perceive, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it's an interesting book. It's actually a hard read, similar to Steiner's work, where there's a lot of philosophical ideas and different syntax structures that are hard to you have to reread stuff and stuff like that.
Can I jump in real quick though about the idea of beings being behind the universe? Obviously that baffled me when I first heard it, and just recently I came across a sort of a couple concepts. You put them together and it starts to make a little bit more sense. Something that I forget which philosopher did it, but it used to be that if something exists, it has to exist in the mind of something. They actually understood this pretty well back in the day. So if it's not that the universe just exists inside of nothing. It's the question of, well, where did the universe come from, right? Or where is the universe? Some people ask like how big it is, or where is it, or when is it, right? Like what these questions.
It's a giant's marble within a giant's marble.
Right. So there's it's called infinite regress. You have the problem of infinite regress. So they solved that problem in one way, is that, the universe exists inside of the mind of God, right?
Sure.
So if the universe that I see exists in my mind, well, the thing that I'm seeing has to exist in some other mind, right?
Right.
Well, this is the idea of beings behind natural things in the universe. So if you're a materialist, you think that the universe popped out of nothing and is now self-supporting. And so all of these, the Big Bang, which is of course an unscientific theory at the heart of it.
It's big bullshit is what it is.
It's a big old assumption.
It's a great TV show, man.
Yeah, big science.
Yeah. So if like, say, particles are, they're out there just whizzing around for themselves. Well, if you find that to be unscientific, well, then you need to, to figure out, well, what are they in? And again, they're in a mind. So then this is a really, really nice. So what is humanity trying to accomplish, right? I'm going to take it to a big final conception real quick, and then we can understand it. I just came to this too. I didn't necessarily read this specifically, but this is kind of a summarization of what I've been reading with Steiner. you're a consciousness and you have free will. So you can host, you can view the universe that you're in, or you can ask, you can query for a larger set of data. So you can move yourself around anywhere you want, depending on what you want to do. So, and then you can also embrace individuals, other minds, as much as you want to do. So if you're selfish and you say, I want to become, like I used to want to become an NBA basketball player. So if that's how I put all my time into being an NBA basketball player, right? That's nothing wrong with that. But there's another opportunity. You could put your time into another person. So maybe I become a tutor, or I become, a philanthropist. Well, so if I truly become philanthropic and I stop acting for myself and I start acting for somebody else that's in need, well, the more that I do that, the more people I can bring into my ego and act for them from my free spirit, act for someone else. Well, maybe it is that we are trying to get us to a place where we are willing to embrace everyone on the planet, right? It's sort of theoretical, but if I'm willing to embrace, if I'm the type of soul now, if my spirit is gotten into the habit of embracing other people and allowing them to achieve through me, well, all of a sudden now I'm a thing in the universe that the universe could use to support other beings' growth. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So now if I can have so Steiner has this unbelievable capacity for intellect. He can hold, Tesla. I wanted to read something from Tesla, but Tesla's the same thing, right? They were actually born 4 years apart. Only
we know
several
a lot
hundred
about Tesla. Yeah, we love Tesla.
So he's got, he has the whole quote, I don't need to build a machine to see if it works, because I can look at every part and twist it and spin and dial it, and I could break that part and see what else breaks. Like he could do that all in his
head. Yeah, he builds.
So he has this incredible ability to support information in his mind. Now let's just say you become a thing that the universe uses to support other patterns, and then it lets other people live inside you, right? Or live inside that pattern that you're projecting. You're using your mental capabilities to hold still something so that other people can benefit from it. Well, that to me sounds like what the universe is. So the hierarchies are spirits that decided to hold still a really intense conception of something, and so that other things could live inside that thing and grow. Gotcha. So when someone says the crystal world is supported by spirits or beings, it could be that they're not as complicated as we are, but they lived a life on a planet just like we did, and they learned how to love just like we are trying to do, and they learned how to hold incredible conceptual schemes in their head just like we can do. And you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the natural world is built from elements of other beings that love us and want us to succeed and grow, to add to the picture.
Absolutely.
And then to cap that off, there's the question of, well, if love already exists in the universe, there's this great loving God out there. Well, why do anything else? Why would loving God send us out to be suffering on this planet and then just to get back to him? It never made sense to me that there's this thing ahead of us that we have to get to. It kicked us back and then we have to get to it. So,
but we're all about testing though, right? I mean, we're all about, we give tests, we test other people, we challenge other people. There's a certain element that, and it's inherent in us. It's something I'm sure that's been going on for a long, long time. So that's why I think maybe if we have a piece of God, that's what that is. It's this.
I think I agree with you. So my conception is a simple, just a little turn off of that, which is Tom Campbell points out that a thing that exists has 3 choices. It can either stay the same, devolve, or evolve. So the thing about staying the same is it's very, very hard because the world is chaotic, right? Yeah. So staying the same is hardly an option. Really what's going to happen eventually is you're going to either evolve or devolve. So those are the 2 choices, is one or the other. And so the choice of love is the choice to continue to evolve. So it's this idea of stability and change. So God, to remain loving, needs to continue to grow, lest it become unloving and devolve.
Gotcha.
So that necessity to continue to be loving is this necessity to evolve. And so the universe is going to continue to create out of itself in order to maintain a stability towards love and not to fall apart. So it doesn't have the option to be stagnant. So God cannot be stagnant in that sense, because it would die, right? If nothing is no longer moving, it's just this, I don't think we would have an experience if the universe came to this point of stagnation. So it either has to evolve or devolve. And so that's why I think creation will continue. And we are here to add to and stabilize love and all that. That's it. Okay.
Boom.
Boom. End of episode. No, dude, that was awesome, man. You did a great job explaining all that. You know, ending on the love and the light, I think, is a great way to end this, because at the end of the day, I think, you know, you're right. I think if we all loved a little bit more and understood each other a little bit more and understood some of these concepts, whether what we're saying is realistic or scientifically applicable or whatever you want to say, at the end of the day, I think these concepts are important because they represent an idealism for something that's good, as opposed to individualism of negative things.
I kind of want to interrupt you, because I think that's the main thrust I'd like to give, is that if people that identify with spiritual movements or anything, and I'm really for the idea of considering all possibilities. So I think someone that doesn't consider aliens, that doesn't consider conspiracies, that doesn't consider these kind of things, they should do all those things. But the main message I take away from Steiner is that we can know reality, and that we have a very specific function, and it's not hokum or woo or all this stuff. Reading Steiner's early works, I think, gives you this scientific, philosophical foundation to build a better world. So that's my main thrust. It's not woo-woo. It's not. You don't have to be. You can be as skeptical as you want and read this stuff and be convinced. So that's kind of the thrust I'd like to end, or to give this episode, is that it's out there, and I hope, I don't know, Steiner may be important.
He's very important. Actually, what you just said, I think, did you hear about the Mars announcement yesterday? Not that it was some
super interesting.
So, you know, there's compounds out there, which I think is interesting. So I think, though, that doesn't change anything. You know, like, that's why I think Rudolf Steiner is important too, because everything you just explained is not affected by finding life or finding a plant or finding an alien or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it all fits. Yep.
Awesome. Well, Andrew Tischler, we got to get you back on here. Super enlightening, awesome ideas, awesome concepts. We appreciate you, coming on and spending the last hour and a half with us, and we got to get you back on here.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate the opportunity. This is really the first opportunity I've had to talk about this in any sort of public forums. I'm super appreciative. I had a lot of fun. You guys are great. I really do appreciate it. So thank you for giving me this space. And yeah.
Awesome, bro. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Talk to you.
Yeah.
Peace.